Now we're starting the next panel. It's called The Fetishism of Folk Art and the Crime of Ornament. The first speaker will be Katya Denisova. I hope I'm spelling it in a nearly correct way. Katya Denisova is a PhD candidate at the Coulthard Institute of Art in London and a research fellow at the University in Tübingen, Germany. Her research investigates the influence of socio-political factors on Ukrainian art, modern art, and she is co-curator of the traveling exhibition In the Eye of the Storm you have seen this morning, and the co-editor of the accompanying catalog. She's working in her PhD about the title Fragmented Identities Between Cosmopolitism and Nationalism in Ukraine's Early 20s Art. A Fragmented Identities presents a history of modern art in Ukraine from a Ukrainian perspective. We had this morning different speeches about perspectives from England or from Britain or from Anglo-Saxon. Now we have a Ukrainian, especially Ukrainian perspective, while acknowledging the country's complex geopolitical situation. Such an approach reveals Ukrainian cultural syncretism and the diverse identities of its people. By deconstructing center-periphery relations, this thesis of her PhD contributes to the ongoing debates over the de-imperialization on structures of power in the post-Soviet region. The survey she's making is of artistic modernism in Ukraine, a phenomenon all of its own, yet inevitably and intrinsically linked to Imperial Russian, Soviet, and bordered European modernisms, yields a more nuanced understanding of network of artistic exchange and interconnectivity across the European continent. She has had different lectures at the College Art Association annual conference in Chicago. She had a lecture in Brisbane. She is working at the very famous Coulthard Institute and had also lectures in the Columbia University and National Gallery in Denmark. She is now speaking about From Folk to Abstract, Ukrainian Embodied as a Medium of Modernist Experimentation. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Alexander, for the introduction, and thank you to Konstantin and Miroslav for masterminding this symposium. It's a great privilege to be speaking today alongside such esteemed colleagues along all of the panels. And I also want to extend thanks to the Belvedere Museum for not only hosting our exhibition, but also kind of creating a program of accompanying events. So I will begin my talk today by looking at one item. An embroidered female purse created in 1917 by Ukrainian peasant artisans in a textile workshop located in the village of Verbivka, based on the design of the artist Alexandra Exter. This multicolored abstract composition was executed with cotton yard threads on black moire fabric and made in the technique of satin stitch. Thank you, Miroslav. In the technique of satin stitch, known in Ukrainian as hlad, in which stitches covered the whole surface of the embroidery. I propose that by examining this item, we can reverse center-periphery relations, since it helps elucidate the correlation between the iconography of traditional Ukrainian embroidery and experiments in modernist painting that led to the emergence of abstraction. Such an approach challenges the established concept of the so-called Russian avant-garde, a homogeneous and monoethnic prism through which the studio in Verbivka and Exter's practice have been mainly viewed in Anglophone scholarship to date. At the same time, through this object, I explored the hybridity and transcultural links in the artistic production of early 20th century Ukraine as conditioned by the Russian imperial project. This, in turn, expands the methodology of post-independence Ukrainian art history, taking it beyond national historiography to reinvest into the study of transnational exchanges. The artist Alexandra Exter is the principal actor in my inquiry. Born in 1882 in the Polish town of Białystok, then under the Russian Empire, to a Greek mother and a Belarusian Jewish father, she moved to Kiev at a young age. She studied at the Kiev Art School, a college-type institution of secondary education, and visited Paris for the first time in 1906, relocating to the French capital more permanently the following year. The move allowed Exter to develop friendship with many artists who pioneered the new trends of Cubism and Futurism. She also had numerous connections within the progressive art circles of Moscow and St. Petersburg, acting as an emissary who introduced artists of the Russian Empire to innovative artistic developments. Despite her extensive sojourns in France, Exter remained devoted to Kiev, returning there regularly and actively participating in the city's cultural life. Concurrently with exhibiting in Europe, Exter engaged in studying, preserving, and promoting Ukrainian folk handicrafts. She was particularly keen to employ compositional and chromatic principles of traditional Ukrainian embroidery to expand the visual language of modern art. Exter's interest in Ukrainian folk art was sparked through her friendship with Natalia Davydova, a Ukrainian noblewoman artist and patron of the arts, peasant handicrafts in particular. In the early 1900s, Davydova organized a studio dedicated to collecting and recreating traditional models of Ukrainian embroidery in her country estate, Verbivka, in central Ukraine. Exter became involved with the workshop, undertaking research trips to find original samples for artisans to copy and eventually supplying her own designs for textiles. Davydova and Exter belonged to Kiev's multicultural milieu, where historical background and imperial context conditioned a peculiar intersection of Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and Jewish upper-class strata. Their cosmopolitan circle included, among others, the Polish composer Karol Szymanowski, the Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, and the Jewish poet Benedict Lifshitz, as well as such artists as Volodymyr and David Burlyuk. And we saw Exter with them in the photograph on the right. At the same time, Davydova and Exter were affiliated with the group of intelligentsia and gentry in Ukraine who sought to preserve the indigenous folk and decorative arts. At first glance, attempts to preserve their local vernacular culture by the upper classes in Ukraine align with the broader handicraft revival undertakings within the Russian Empire and across Europe, inspired by the arts and crafts movement in England. Efforts to cultivate peasant handicrafts to soften the threat of modern art to the traditional rural way of living, by creating local employment for the peasantry and lessening the lure of factory jobs in urban centers. A crucial stimulus for recognizing and appreciating peasant crafts across the Russian Empire was the abolishment of serfdom by Tsar Alexander II in 1861, which liberated an estimated 22 million peasants across the empire, or 35% of its total population. While in Western European countries, the handicraft revival endeavors were aimed at peasants who produced goods mainly for their own consumption. In the Russian Empire, the endangered kustari, or handicraftsmen, were already participating in the commercial exchange of goods and dependent on their trade for a living. In a typical scenario, members of a peasant family, including teenage children, attended a landlord's fields during the warm months of the year, and in the winter, the females engaged in craft production such as weaving and embroidery, which was largely for sale. Proponents of the revival movement also strove to safeguard examples of traditional peasant production that was increasingly replaced by factory manufactured items. In Ukraine, however, these pursuits had a defined national bent, since they were undertaken at a time when the Tsarist authorities prohibited the use of the Ukrainian language and severely restricted the development of Ukrainian culture. The strictest of such decrees banning publications and education in the Ukrainian language was adopted in 1876. And therefore, one field left for the Ukrainian intelligentsia to engage was ethnography. Ukrainian cultural practitioners viewed their local vernacular traditions as a vehicle for preserving and asserting Ukraine's unique national character at a time when it was negated by the imperial authorities and ideology. And so it might be fitting to consider the engagement with the indigenous folk culture as corresponding to the revival movements among the nations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Baltic region, the latter also controlled by Russia at the time. In reviewing the use of peasant design in Austro-Hungary, the art historian David Crowley outlines how other non-titular nations of the dual monarchy reconfigured their approach to the peasantry in an attempt to challenge and undermine the existing imperial structures. Likewise, Philip Herzog describes how Estonian intellectuals of the 19th century used folklore motifs from the local peasant culture to create nationally inclined literature and music. Similarly, pursuing a patriotic agenda of their own, the nationally mobilized Ukrainian elite was eager to use folk art to formulate and reassert the distinctiveness of Ukrainian culture within the imperial context. An early example of such ethnographic work was the album Ukrainian Folk Ornament, Embroideries, Textiles, Easter Eggs, published in 1876 by Olha Kosich, a Ukrainian writer and ethnographer. Because of the decree banning Ukrainian language publications, the book was actually printed in Russian. Illustrated with 36 sheets of various embroidery ornaments, 4 sheets with patterns for textiles, and 1 sheet with 23 drawings of Easter eggs, the study summarized Kosich's inspection of the visual folk culture in the Volyn region of Western Ukraine. The publication attempted to determine to what extent Ukrainian ornamentation was original as opposed to being borrowed from other nations. While Kosich limited her investigation to a single gubernia or province of the Volyn Governorate, her approach was systematic and methodological, and she conducted her research in dialogue with international scholarship. As such, she referenced Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament in its 1860 German language edition. She also references Südslawische Ornament by Felix Ley and Friedrich Fisbach from 1871, and Vladimir Stasov's Ruski Narodny Ornament, which was published in 1872. The cover image for the 1878 French-Ukrainian edition of Kosich's book, which you see on the slide here, it was published to coincide with Exposition Universelle in Paris that year, is not worth I think this cover image is noteworthy for its staged presentation of a traditional Ukrainian women's attire, somewhat mirrored from a photograph of Kosich taken in 1875, which you also see on the slide. Both images capture a seated female figure dressed in a highly decorated garment consisting of a plachta, a woolen overskirt with geometrized pattern, a white linen blouse with embroidered collar and sleeves, known in Ukrainian as vyshivanka, and a sleeveless embroidered kasetka on top of it, and a necklace of multiple color bead strings. While we can see the figure in the cover image of the publication sporting high leather boots or choboty, in Ukrainian, more festive footwear of the Ukrainian peasantry. In the photograph, Kosich's feet are entirely covered by a full skirt typical for 19th century women's clothing. Another notable distinction between the two outfits is the headwear. While the figure on the book cover is wearing a white ochipok, a cap worn by married Ukrainian peasant women, with a shawl on top of it, Kosich's hair is styled more loosely with a dark kerchief-like headband holding it together. These differences are not coincidental, for while the cover image sought to present traditional folk clothing, Kosich's outfit is a manifestation of the efforts by the Ukrainian intelligentsia at the time to integrate elements of folk traditions into modern culture. The custom of wearing embroidered peasant shirts and other elements of the traditional peasant attire originated among the Ukrainian patriots in the late 1850s as the way to signal their allegiance to the Ukrainian nation. The historian Serhiy Yekelchik has described such endeavors as, and I quote, conscious construction of the new Ukrainian high culture in the name of the peasantry and from the rudiments of folk culture, end of quote. In the book section on embroidery, Kosich compared Ukrainian ornaments with those of other Slavic nations, Russians in particular. The author contended that there were two main differences between the Russian and Ukrainian examples. To create patterns, Ukrainian used more geometrized ornaments derived from floral motifs with limited incorporation of realistic elements. Kosich observed that while the Ukrainian style developed themes of pure ornamentation and simplified forms, to which on occasion she even referred to as непредметный or objectless, the Russian took on a pictorial character marked by the abundance of figurative images, such as birds, people, horses, lions, and dragons. As for color, Kosich noted the Russian embroidery tended to be monochromatic with the sole use of red, whereas Ukrainians deployed a broader plethora of hues, often juxtaposing contrasting shades, yellow and blue, white and black, red and green. She illustrated this latter point with a sheet containing ornaments for textiles, plachtas in particular, and you can see this on the slide, two of those sheets. And the more figurative and unique color examples of Russian embroideries, as described by Kosich, can be found in the 1889 publication Великорусские узоры, or the Great Russian Patterns. Many members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia and land-owning gentry, including Olha Kosich and Natalia Davidova, participated in staging the South Russian exhibition of applied arts and handicrafts that opened at the Kiev Museum of Industrial Arts and Science in February 1906. And South Russian in the title refers to the territory, kind of the Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire. That was the official denomination used for Ukrainian lands. Unofficially, Ukraine was known as Malorussia, or Little Russia, in the official imperial rhetoric. And so the preparation for this initiative, it started in 1905, and while the organizational process was slowed down by the revolution and ensuing unrest that country, the project benefited from the subsequent liberalization. As one of the revolution's outcomes, the decree prohibiting the use of the Ukrainian language became de facto void, and Ukrainian was recognized by the imperial authorities as a language in its own right. With the ban on the Ukrainian language lifted, local intelligentsia could pursue cultural initiatives more easily and openly. The 1906 show occupied 2 floors of the Kiev Museum and contained thousands of objects, both contemporary and historical samples of handicraft production. The exhibition presented a moment of confluence with the different classes of Ukrainian society, the land-owning gentry, intelligentsia, and peasantry, coming together from across the imperial borders. Specifically, the show featured a section dedicated to the craft production of Hutus, a group of highlanders from the Carpathian Mountains in western Ukraine, a region under Austria-Hungary at the time. And you can see this section in the top image on this slide. The show not only pursued an ideological task of showcasing and celebrating Ukrainian folk tradition, but it also served a practical purpose as a marketplace. One of the photographs taken during the exhibition, and this is the one on the bottom, captures embroiderers from the Podillia province in south-central Ukraine, displaying and selling their manufactured goods in the museum lobby. The exhibition therefore made a claim for the national unity of the Ukrainian lands despite the split between the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, and presented a chance to cross class divisions to recover the Ukrainian cultural heritage. While preparing for the exhibition, Natalia Davidova invited Alexander Exter to assist with the collection of embroidery and pottery. In addition to her work on the selection committee, she also organized and paid for one of the rooms within the exhibition, which recreated an interior of a wealthy 18th century Ukrainian, or as it was called at the time, Little Russian house. The Ukrainian archaeologist and ethnographer Vadim Sherbakivsky left his recollection of this room. It contained a selection of old ceramics and Cossack weaponry, with a kobzar, and Kobzar was an iterant Ukrainian bard, playing the bandura, a traditional multi-stringed musical instrument, and singing his dumas, the epic songs, in this space daily. In her analysis of the exhibition, the American scholar Alla Mizeliv notes that it was important for the organizers to underscore the familiarity of the displayed objects, thus presenting craft as part of Ukraine's forgotten visual language of the last 2 centuries, of which the visitors had to be reminded. The placement of items of peasant production within the reconstructed room, a glimpse of which we can see in the top image on this slide, could have served this purpose. Due to the angle of this image, it does not capture those elements as described by Sherbakivsky, but instead we can see the textiles decorated the entrance, that the floor was covered with a carpet of floral design, and the pieces of wooden furniture were placed inside and outside this space. Additionally, Exter devised a display for carpets and embroideries that can be seen in the presentation of folk art from the Podillia region, and this is the image on the top. Traditional carpets covered walls from the ceiling to the floor. Embroidered shirts and hand towels known as rushniki were displayed asymmetrically, showing those with decorative patterns, and rows of hand-painted Easter eggs or pisanki formed a sort of frieze in the middle. Samples of pottery and ceramics complemented the arrangement. What this image does not capture is the vibrancy and colorfulness that must have characterized the display, given the Ukrainian peasants' proclivity to deploy multiple hues as described by Kosach. And I've included this slide just to show you a little bit of a flavor of how those hand towels, the rushniki, and the Easter eggs must have looked. And these samples, which come from the Ivan Honchar Museum in Kiev, they were all created in the late 19th and early 20th century, so around kind of the same time as the exhibition. Both the reconstructed Ukrainian interior and the overall display created an immersive experience, a total artwork in a sense, which can be viewed as a precursor to Exter's explorations in stage design in the late 1910s and 1920s. One of the outcomes of the exhibition was the establishment of the Kiev Handicraft Society to promote Ukrainian folk art across the Russian Empire, with Davidova serving as its first chair and Exter joining as a member. The year 1906 was critical for Exter's artistic development in another respect. She visited Western Europe, including Paris, for the first time. While this trip introduced you to some of the newest trends in art, it is important to remember that by then she was already intimately acquainted with Ukrainian folk traditions. In 1907, Exter settled in Paris more permanently, enrolling to take classes in several of the city's private academies. She soon discovered the art of Henri Matisse and other Fauvists with their coloristic freedom and abundance. One might reasonably speculate that the young artist was drawn to their paintings because they reaffirmed her chromatic preferences acquired through her exposure to Ukrainian folk art. But it was not only the colors of peasant handicrafts that inspired Exter, and she was also keen to adapt their compositional elements. The Russian art critic Yakov Tugendholt, in his 1922 monograph on Exter, observed that she conceived her paintings as densely filled carpets, evenly saturated with form. Exter's still life with carob and fruit from circa 1906 can serve to illustrate this point. While the canvas unmistakably references the art of Matisse and Cézanne, I suggest that Exter's treatment of the background also aligns with the decorative traditions of Ukrainian folk art. In her later writings, the artist would attest to this by stipulating that, and I quote, "An essential characteristic of this kind of art, meaning drawings for fabrics, carpets, and embroideries, is the flat treatment of forms in ornament, be they floral, animal, or architectural, and that a decorative composition is characterized by its subservience to rhythm, which can be looser and more complex than that of a painted composition," end of quote. We can see how this principle is translated into Exter's painting as early as 1907. This still life conveys an inherent compositional rhythm with contrasting colors. The orange-red flowers of the wallpaper, for example, oppose the deep green of the glass bottle and the patches of the same color on the tablecloths. Although Exter uses different floral motifs for the wallpaper and the tablecloths, the pattern nonetheless appears to pass from the surface of the table to the wall and onto the frame painting hanging on it, intensifying the flattening of picture planes. This leads to a fusing of background and foreground into a single pictorial plane, which is simultaneously reminiscent of Matisse's canvases with their integration of figure and space, and the widespread custom in Ukraine of decorating both walls and floors with traditional carpets or kilimim. A compelling case can therefore be made that Exter's initial inspiration was drawn from Ukrainian decorative designs before being reconfirmed and developed into an artistic system through her exposure to art practices in Western Europe. In the 1910s, Exter continued to divide her time between Paris and the Russian Empire, regularly returning to Kiev. She reached a new level of engagement with Ukrainian folk art in 1914 when Natalia Davidova invited her to oversee the artistic direction of the Verbivka embroidery studio. Exter proposed to relinquish pure imitation and preservation of existing forms to allow for the emergence of new embroidery. Her ambition was to abandon the established practice of creating designs that replicated 18th and 19th century embroideries characterized by the chromatic dullness that they acquired with time. Instead, Exter wanted to explore the brightness and dynamism of peasant drawings, embroideries, and Easter eggs. Practically, Davidova and Exter achieved modernization by incorporating embroidery into contemporary design and fashion. Conceptually, they expanded the traditional realm by inviting leftist artists to capture their artistic explorations in sketches for embroidery, which were transferred to needlework charts and sewn by peasant artisans in Verbivka. Exter and Davidova also encouraged the peasant artisans to participate in the creative process, acknowledging their potential as individual artists and not mere craftsmen. Within a couple of years, the studio's output shifted from textiles with floral arrangements executed in a cold and austere palette common for revival studios, and this you can see in the image on the left, which captures some of the samples of embroideries produced in the Verbivka that were exhibited in 1913. The image on the right is of the embroidery that the workshop created 3 years later, and I will return to it in a couple of minutes. The engagement of modernist artists with folk traditions in Ukraine developed concurrently with the emergence of the so-called neo-primitivism in Russia proper. However, there was a conceptual difference in the use of folk art by the Russian artists and those working in Ukraine. For the likes of Natalia Goncharova and Mikhail Larionov, as the American scholar Wendy Salmond outlines, and I quote, "It was a contemporary artist to emulate only the essence of peasant art's primitive spirit, not its pedestrian forms. Nor was it his or her task to fight against the decline of folk art by actively intervening in its protection," end of quote. Such stimulation of the essence pursued a twofold agenda. On the one hand, the incorporation of elements of low peasant culture served the necessary appetite to shock the bourgeoisie. On the other, the use of Asian and Pantrali tradition from the so-called East provided means to differentiate Russian artists from their counterparts in Western Europe. It was their version of the exotic other. Such strategies appear to be alien to Davidova and Exter in their work with peasant artisans in Verbivka. Their approach was less calculated, since they maintained that examples of traditional techniques should be collected, studied, and reinvigorated through new forms, as opposed to simply inspiring the artists. For Davidova, peasants, or more specifically Ukrainian peasants, who had previously worked with examples of traditional Ukrainian ornament, and their engagement with new art were of utmost importance. The poet Vera Lurie, who knew Davidova during their emigre years in Berlin, recalled that Davidova had emphasized her desire to exhibit peasant artisans on par with professional artists. On par with professional artists. Also, unlike the neo-primitivists in Russia, who, to paraphrase Goncharova, and I quote, shook the dust away from their feet and distanced themselves from the West, end of quote, Exter and Davidova continued to be inspired by the developments in their artistic production on Western Europe and did not wish to sever links with colleagues there. I suggest that artists coming from or working in Ukraine were eager to maintain a dialogue with their international counterparts as a way to overcome Ukraine's cultural provincialization and marginalization inflicted by the empire through the forced russification of cultural processes and removal of talent to the metropole. In November 1915, Exter and Davidova organized an exhibition in Moscow titled Contemporary Decorative Art, Embroideries and Carpets Based on Artist Sketches that featured textiles executed by artisans from Verbivka based on designs by a cohort of leftist artists soon to be associated with suprematism, including Kazimir Malevich himself. The show preceded by 1 month the opening of the last futurist exhibition in Petrograd, which was the first public showing of Malevich's suprematist canvases. This prompted such scholars as Charlotte Douglas and Alexandra Shatskih to speculate that suprematism might have first appeared in public not as paintings, but as needlework or sketches for needlework. According to the catalogue of the Contemporary Decorative Art exhibition, Malevich exhibited 2 designs for scarves and 1 for a pillow. However, based on a photograph published in a photograph from the show published in a weekly newspaper, in which we can see two of Malevich's works on the podium in the center and the third one hanging on the wall on the right. It appears that Shatsky has pointed out that what he showed were not designs but fully fledged suprematist canvases that the artists used the opportunity to present as designs. We know that Malevich was keen for suprematism to have a broad application outside the constraints of easel painting, and the journal Supremus, which he was looking to publish as the platform for the new movement, meant to include a separate section on applied arts. The question arises as to the rationale that prompted some of the most radical artists of the day to engage with folk embroidery. Writing in 1918, Exter maintained that decorative designs for Ukrainian embroideries and carpets were legible to contemporary artists because they approached this as coloristic tasks with sophisticated rhythm and complex compositions. In a way, both Ukrainian folk art and modern art treated rhythm as its plot or the main subject matter. In his review of the 1915 exhibition, Tuchenkold grasped a similar intention when he stated that, and I quote, "Here the non-objective colorfulness returns to its original source, a patched quilt of peasants," end of quote. Such interpretations align with Malevich's concept of цветопись, or color painting, the pure notion of color obtained once the illusion of depicting things is removed and clear two-dimensional surfaces are used instead. In suprematism, Malevich treated colors as individual units with their boundaries unmixed and separated. I would therefore argue that the embroideries allowed artists to inspect the texture of color, its density, spatiality, and mass, thus looking to solve some of the main tasks in 20th century painting: the correlation of colors, the texture of volumes, and delineation of color planes. We can examine such work with color through a rare surviving example from the time, the 1916 suprematist embroidery executed by the Verbivka workshop, based on a design by Nina Henke. The composition consists of 5 brightly colored interlinked geometric forms, like the strict shapes favored by other artists associated with suprematism. The pink and white forms showcase the effect of light reflecting this in silk threads, adding to the dynamism of the composition, while the density of stitches throughout the embroidery allows for textural depth and volume. The sharp outlines of each form and the interplay of their colors help achieve chromatic saturation and vibrancy. In the year that followed the 1915 exhibitions, Malevich was busy consolidating artistic energies around suprematism. The artist, who was born in Kyiv to Polish parents and grew up in the Ukrainian countryside, was accustomed to Ukrainian peasant art from early childhood. In his unfinished biography from 1933, Malevich reflected on this exposure, stating that he saw the main difference between country peasants and city workers in the former's ability to paint. Strikingly, Malevich used the word искусство, or art, to describe peasants' activities of painting their houses and sewing their clothes. In 1916 and 17, following the introduction by Exter, he became close with Natalia Davidova, and their alliance added another dimension to the development of suprematism. We can view Verbivka as a laboratory for testing the new style by commissioning artists to create suprematist designs for reproduction in embroidery. The results of this collaboration were presented at the second exhibition of contemporary decorative art, which opened in Moscow in December 1917, not long after the Bolsheviks took over the city following the October Revolution. The show included approximately 400 items produced in Verbivka based on sketches by 16 artists. From preserved photographs, we can judge that many exhibits were designed based on the visual vocabulary developed by the Supremacist Society. While Malevich contributed only 3 sketches in 1915, 2 years later he expanded his participation to designs for 17 items, including 9 pillows and 4 handbags. An installation shot showing a pillow embroidered based on his design has survived alongside the untitled painting that matches its composition. Even though I have not come across a reference to Ukrainian embroidery or other handicrafts in any of Malevich's writings on suprematism, which is unsurprising given the artist's tendency to mystify its origins, mystifying its origins, upon studying examples from the Podylia region of Ukraine where he grew up, it is possible to suggest that such items of peasant handicrafts from the region could have left a visual imprint that he carried into his art. as kind of by way of conclusion, I would like to look again at Exter's purse, which was likely included in the 1917 exhibition in Moscow. While the purely abstract composition of this design betrays the influence of suprematism, it is important to note that Exter never fully converted to Malevich's new painterly language and philosophy. Given her cosmopolitan outlook, I suggest that several transcultural encounters also informed her work with applied arts in the 1910s. Chief among this was her dialogue with Fernand Léger and Sonia Delaunay. In the interest of time, I will focus only on Exter's engagement with Léger, whom she probably first met while attending Maria Vasilyeva's Academy in Paris, where he gave 2 lectures on modern art in 1913 and 1914. It appears that the 2 artists stayed in touch, and according to Ardennio Soffici, the Italian futurist artist and writer and Exter's lover at the time, Léger advised Exter on her painting. I know, I'm finishing. I'm aware. I also have a flight to catch, so I need to finish, I know. So I believe that the artistic conversation is visible in the abstracting grammar of the 1913 purse, especially in Exter's purse and Léger's serious contrast of forms from 1913 and 14. In her design, citing Léger, Exter constructs the composition with bulky geometric shapes of fragmenting cones and cylinders, modeling and delineating them with black contours. But unlike Léger, Exter uses unmodulated blocks of color with volume emerging through the embroidery technique itself and the 3-dimensionality of applied stitches. Experiments with embroidery allowed Exter to work with color in a free and constructive manner, exploring its dynamic qualities, transparency, and density, all of which would find reflection in her painting and theater design in the late 1910s and 1920s. To conclude, and as I have argued in my paper today, Alexandra Exter's and Natalia Davidova's simultaneous engagement with cosmopolitan urban culture and Ukrainian vernacular crafts stimulated the transition to non-objectivity in the Russian Empire. In a way, the transcultural exchanges both inside and outside the country, to its west and east, converged at Verbivka. Instigated by Davidova and even more so by Exter through her espousal of the 20th century most radical art trends, this small village on the empire's periphery conditioned the confluence of progressive artists and local peasantry that contributed to the development of abstract art in the 1910s. This example prompts us to reconsider the perceived passivity and anti-modernity of vernacular culture and view it instead, or maybe recognize it instead as an agent of modernity and even abstraction. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Can I step down from this absolutely
Yes.
blinding light?
So you have a question?
I have a very brief question, because as a hypothesis, influence of Padilla embroidery of Malevich maybe could be accepted. We came through the very long and painful tradition of connecting Malevich to Ukrainian folk art. But on the same level, we can say that Fernand Léger was influenced probably by the same embroidery. We have the same color here. So I'm just saying about danger of this.
No, I completely agree with you, and I kind of don't subscribe to some of the other theories that kind of link Malevich to folk art and how kind of it all developed. But Léger didn't spend his childhood in Padilla, did he? So I think it can be viewed as stretched, but I think there is some merit in it too. I think what I'm trying to show is that context is important, and we need to know where the artists are coming from, what they see growing up, and how they kind of develop as artists. So I think that was what I was trying to do. But yeah, valid point, totally, I agree with you.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much. May I ask, do we have some details about the organization of the work in the workshop? For example, follow-up question, was there a school for young craftsmen and craftswomen? Thank you.
It's embroider and make textiles. I'm not aware of it being the case in Verbivka, but as I say, there is very little by way of actual information how the kind of the logistics, how the processes were organized. We don't really know even the kind of the chain of how, when the artists such as Malevich and kind of other artists working in Moscow and St. Petersburg at this time, when they created those designs, how they were kind of passed on to the peasants and how that process was organized. I have no idea, I've never come across
And
any.
about the exchange between crafts and
Exactly, yeah, yes, yes. Thank you.
Are there any more?
Thank you. School was in every Ukrainian house, in every Ukrainian peasant house, from grandmother to mother to daughters. This art was taught and taught and taught. So each Ukrainian house was a small school. And concerning Malevich, yes, we need to be careful, but at the same time, we need to remember that before he died, a couple years before he died, he wrote his second autobiography, and he knew that his art would be put in parts by the Soviet regime, by Stalin. And the dying artist was writing that I was Ukrainian. He wrote that my best teacher were Ukrainian peasants, and he praised Ukrainian art as nothing else. So we get used to link Malevich to everything else, but not Ukrainian art. So we shouldn't be too modest and too afraid to revise, decolonize. And you're doing a great job.
I agree with you, but I think we also need to be extremely careful with what Malevich wrote. I mean, I think Malevich was one of those personalities that was bigger than life, and he really liked to mystify and kind of create legends about himself. And we also need to, there are also other instances when Malevich clearly called himself Polish. So we really need to be, we cannot take those kind of statements at face value. We really need to be careful with them. So yeah, it's kind of, you need to maintain this balance of kind of studying the sources and looking at the context, but also kind of transcending that a little bit.
Any more? Okay. So, thank you very much. So the next speaker will be Konstantin Akinsha. He's well known in Vienna. He made Silver Age and the Semper Depot exhibitions. He's an international, I would say, specialist about Ukrainian art, independent art historian, curator, journalist. He received the George Polk Award for cultural reporting in 1991. Akinsha's curatorial project includes Silver Age, I said, in the Belvedere, Russian modernism, cross currents of German and Russian art in the Neue Galerie in New York. I'm a Drop in the Ocean, Art of Ukrainian Revolution im Künstlerhaus, Permanent Revolution, Ukrainian Art Today in the Ludwig Museum in Budapest, and Between Fire and Fire, Ukrainian Art in the Semper Depot in the Akademie der Bildenden Künste. He's the founding director of the Avant-Garde Research Project and the author of several books, including Beautiful Loot, The Soviet Plunder of Europe's Art Treasure. Since the beginning of the Russian aggression, Akinsha documented the destruction of the cultural heritage of Ukrainian by Russian occupiers in his personal blogs and numerous articles, published in the Wall Street Journal, FAZ, and Neue Zürcher Zeitung. He has a blog documenting the destruction of cultural heritage by troops in the Ukraine, and this is very, very big engagement, very good engagement. So now he's speaking about ornament and avant-garde, something very different from what I had, let's say. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. I want to start with a remark. The name of my presentation is in a sense, ironic. Of course, when I'm talking about ornament, I'm referring to the famous essay of Adolf Loos, Ornament and Crime. But the term avant-garde, I'm using in ironic sense, because we are living in the world of too generalized and too outdated definitions. Of course, in our context, avant-garde is calling in mind the definition Russian avant-garde, which is an artificially created umbrella definition coined by the West European art market in the end of 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. Of course, the word avant-garde is coming from fashionable writings of Clement Greenberg, because in the Soviet Union or in Russian traditions, avant-garde was never used as a self-definition by artists. The word was mentioned 3 times, one in quite negative review of Alexandre Benoit, one in the text of Punin dedicated to Russian radical modernism, and it was also used as the name of a magazine which Polishchuk was publishing in Kharkiv, but it was not referring to art, but let's say to socio-progressive dimension of this magazine. So, sorry me for the term avant-garde, we will return to it in the very end of my presentation. Ornament and crime. Ornament was in the beginning of everything. It's in the beginning of the Bible was a word, in the beginning of Ukrainian modernism was ornament, and Ukrainian modernism was not different to secession movement in other so-called new nations, as they were defined as in Austro-Hungarian historiography. By 1903, let's say, stylization of national ornamentation becoming one of the main devices of new Ukrainian art school. And of course, we have a paradigm, we have the building of Poltava Governorate, which was designed by Vasily Krychevsky, and which is heavily used national ornamentation. I think that in this room, many people can provide very similar examples from Czech, Hungarian, Polish, and other traditions. This is another example of this ornamental architecture. By the same time, it's coming to painting too. It's the same year, 1903, portrait of Belashevsky painted by Mikhail Zhuk. And again, of course, we have to have ornamented folk textile on the background. If it is not ornamented textiles, it's interesting to the national type and to the national costumes. You can see here painting by Fyodor Krychevsky called 3 Ages, 1913, and painting by Alexander Barashka, the peasant family, painted in 1914, which is a part of the exhibition. I want to attract your attention by the skirts of this young, nice Ukrainian peasant girl. And here I have to make a footnote. We saw this type of textile on this first slide of Katya's presentation, but it needs some explanation. It's called plachta. It's kind of part of Ukrainian national costume. It's an upper skirt, or actually a piece of textile which was used as an upper skirt by Ukrainian peasant women. And I can say that it's a kind of, sorry for this comparison, national tartan, or female tartan. It's a basic element of national costume. It has this checkered pattern, and Katya described. It's a more kind of abstract type of ornamentation without recognizable figurative elements. This national tartan becoming one of, I can say, curses of Ukrainian modernism. And when we are talking about fetishism of the ornament, we will see demonstrations of this fetishism in different forms. By the fall of the Russian Empire, this passion for ornament becoming predominant. Here you can see meeting of the founders of Ukrainian Academy of Arts, who are basically drawn into the ornamental textiles. Ornament becoming, let's say, collective identity of new Ukrainian state. In 1918, Darwood is designing the face of new state. In a sense, this new state is very interesting. It's a really state corresponding to zeitgeist of the beginning of the 20th century. So ideologically, it's of course based on national self-determination, on ideas of socialism and social democracy, and visually, it's a secession state. I think that it's a state which produced one of the most beautiful banknotes which I know. These two on this side were designed by Vasil Klichevsky, and that one was designed by Narcos. But we can have the full exhibition of these banknotes, which of course heavily using this ornament. We mentioned Plachta, this design group really reminding these Plachta designs. Step by step, more radical modernists are starting to look at the same initially, basically repeating the iconography which was used by the older generation. For example, this work by Vladimir Borlyuk depicting the peasant girl, which is not different into approach to iconography to Murashka painting. The same generation, as Katya said, becoming interested in folk art, trying to find, let's say, gifted peasant artists, like person who became extremely important for Ukrainian art of the first half of the 20th century, Hanna Sobachka-Shostak, who was born in the village of Skopцы, which Katya already mentioned. And she was gifted, like, self-taught painter, but at some moment she is meeting Exter. They have some kind of connection, and Hanna Sobachka-Shostak pushed to kind of production of folk art, but a little bit under supervision of modernism. So they're introducing her to larger formats. She is making, painting these compositions which are variations of folk art. It's not traditional composition for embroidery or something. It's turning into autonomous work of art. And of course, there is no direct connection between her and Ukrainian or Kiev school of Futurism of the period. This connection could be more evident in the color schemes, which is difficult to interpret. Who is influencing who? Extra influencing Hanna Sobachka-Shostak, or Hanna Sobachka-Shostak sense, is not less important than treatment of the books. And here again, we have this rethinking, reimagining of Ukrainian folk ornaments, which calling in mind this plucked checkered structure. Portuguese tried very hard to break the full model, going into applied arts too. And here we have, of course, a problem, because it's different approach than approach of the future generation. They working with ceramics, they are working with production of carpets, and what they are doing by the late period is basically folklore. They are producing kind of works of art which has allegedly look like folk art, but have ideological message, etc., etc. And we are talking about quite broad chronology, because this beautiful carpet with Karl Marx was produced in 1926, and this is one of the latest and, I can say, last creation of Cézanne. It's a part of very important moment to which we will return when we will come to the end of Bolshevism and broad political changes. Main hero of my presentation is Vasily Yermilov. Yermilov is known as a, let's say, founding father of Ukrainian constructivism. It's a very questionable definition, because I don't believe that we have Ukrainian constructivism as such. We had some manifestations which were inspired by constructivism, but which were extremely different to the pure constructivism in its most of form. Initial inspiration. Yermilov, who was starting at Kharkiv, and in the beginning was playing with cubism. You can see this painting, which was obviously inspired by Picasso paintings from the shooting collection, which he saw during his visit in Moscow. His early period, I'm talking about 1920s, were deeply influenced by the school of Bolshevik. I'm not putting here his images of his frescoes for the Red Army Club in Kharkiv, but even his decorative works, like this designs for the agitation train, or his frescoes painted in his own studio. And it's an interesting story, because this photograph was basically never reproduced in comprehensive form, because it's published once on the size of the poster in the book of Pavlov, basically showing us what he is doing. And of course, it's a funny mixture of suprematism and Ukrainian folk motives. And then again, we have these checkered elements which come in, calling in mind the structure of Plachta. By 1921, he is combining, 1922, I'm sorry, like kind of internationalist, cubist approach, to which he needed a matchbox with which has to be produced something else with nice Western brand name, which is making this work like really compared to international cubism, with design for cigarette books, which is fully corresponding to his early approach to national Ukrainian folk art. Then started with these things, which can call in mind everything from early reliefs of Archipenko to ready-made, to, let's say, fascination with suprematism. However, this suprematism getting quite interesting and very decorative form. By 1924, he combined the suprematist elements with the text. This is his famous memorial plaques, Lenin memorial plaques, one of which we have again in the exhibition. And then he participated in the press exhibition when this, let's see, general design made by Lisitsky, including some works produced by Yermin and other artists. He is doing two models of wall newspapers, but to my taste, the most interesting object which Yermilov is producing for this exhibition are albums depicting different successes of Soviet Ukraine. There are serial albums dedicated to different topics, from theater to production of movies. You can see how this album looks inside. It's immediately calling in mind Malevich's suprematism and maybe even more moving into the direction of Lisitsky prose. But it's how they look inside, but how they look outside. So all these albums are binded into plachta. He using a real Ukrainian hand-woven plachta to make covers for these albums. So what we have here is before in Verbica we had Malevich suprematism produced by the village women who were embroidering. Now we have Malevich suprematism wrapped in the real Ukrainian textile, which is provoking an interesting question. This is a work of Zhuk, Mikhailo Zhuk, cetaceanist artist from 1919, which is in the exhibition, to which he added and glued a piece of plachta textile, real textile. Here we have suprematism covered into plachta. So the style is changing, but motivation is not. In the same time, Yermilov, in his free time, when he is not producing Lenin memorial plaques or suprematist reliefs, constantly, maniacally making these images of flowers, which obviously are inspired by not only by Ukrainian folk art, but I can say by Ukrainian low urban art of Kharkiv. He was trained as a house painter, very qualified house painter. And it's a time of stencil decoration, which he is repeating and repeating and repeating. So we have this schizophrenia. If Baumgarten wrote once that after Malevich's black square, we can leave everything, come back to our studios and start to paint flowers. Yermilov painted both black squares and flowers in the same time. And this is leading to his later period. Because as a constructivist, Yermilov basically demonstrated himself more like a designer, not to say interior designer. He never produced any products, like many constructivists even in Russia, which were mass-produced. He designed for himself. His own studio was fully designed. Every object was designed, but it existed in one form. And then combination of highly technological objects, like very puristic designs, and abundance of folk art. It's not constructive. Constructivists will not stick here all these folk ornaments or use so much folk customs. So what we have in there? We have this plachter, which is following us everywhere. So it's a scale of plachters. Here you have this selection from, let's say, Art Nouveau to late Krzyzewski, which is a part of the exhibition. But it's, let's say, more figurative. But then we have these plachters again, which are coming out everywhere. In Wojciech, in Yermilov, in Petritsky. By 1936, the life of Ukrainian modernist project basically is coming to the end. And in this moment we have extremely important event, which I think that is not properly evaluated still in Ukrainian art history. I'm talking about 1936 exhibition of Ukrainian folk art in Moscow, in the Gorky Park, which was, of course, grand event, prepared with all party control, and which became the last exhibition with a serious participation of Bolsheviks, and in many ways prepared it by them, because people were involved in preparation of this exhibition. Padalka, Sedlar, of other artists, Petritsky, Rakitsky, just names the name. It's time of Stalinist tour, when folk art is treated as extremely important element. By this time, real artists have to learn from folk art, not to teach poor peasant women to embroider suprematistic compositions, but to learn the beauty of this folk art. And it's the beginning of the grand campaign. Ukrainian exhibition is one part of it. There are many other exhibitions happening in the Soviet Union during this time, of creation of Stalinist folklore. So, of course, this folk art has to be diluted on this stage by beautiful carvings with Comrade Stalin, which looks like folk art, but designed in reality by Sedlar, or portraits of Lenin designed by him too in the form of carving, or to create new folk artists. Here you can see one of work of Maria Primachenko, who became symbolic Ukrainian artist, and of course it's now the name of the names. But she started, she's an extremely gifted woman, found in the village, put in the workshops of the Ukrainian Museum in Kyiv. And she is initially a Stalinist construct. She had to be this exemplary folk artist. Of course, she is too gifted to be turned. You know, they're enforcing her, she has to paint compositions like this with Chapayev on the horse, or composition like The Court of Animals, which is basically a reference to the Soviet court system of the period. They cannot turn to, but they are trying. I'm finished. So the end of the story is very simple. It's in 1937-38, in Moscow, a huge exhibition, first Stalinist showcase, exhibition of successes of agriculture is constructed. Ukrainian pavilion has dramatic story. We have no time for this. It was constructed, ruined, reconstructed. You see these ornaments. They were created, designs were created by Baraska Vlasenko and by the same Hanna Sabachka Shostak. In this time, these ornaments are turned into frescoes. So instead of Wojciech's idea of frescoes, we are having folk artists from the village story, I want to say that we have to be very careful and attentive to interpretation of the Soviet past, and especially the transition period. Here you can see capitals of the Ukrainian version of the exhibition of successes of people's industry. Because Ukraine in the 20s had its own representation in the Venice Biennial. In the late 1930s, we nearly constructed our version of the Palace of Soviets, for a reason of construction of which the St. Mikhail Monastery in Kiev was destroyed. And by 1949, we got our little own version of exhibition of the successes of people's industry, which was created in Moscow. It was too late, because the project was finished in 1958 when Khrushchev started his war against architectural excesses. But we, being a part of the Third Rome, but not being the Third Rome ourselves, were reserved to the role of Alexandria, let's say the second biggest city in the Roman Empire. And on our capitals, we could have our Ukrainian sunflowers as a sign of the local added to the global imperial art. Thank you very much.
Konstantin, thank you so much for this exhibition which you brought to Vienna and all over Europe, for the depth of your knowledge, for your philosophical approach to Ukrainian modernism. And it's great that you're raising this issue of ornament, because it's in the beginning, it's so much to talk about it, and it's really amazing that you're doing that. Just a small note, when Zhuk you showed, I think he was in general influenced by Japanese art, but kakemono, hanging scrolls, usually, you know, the painting surrounded, framed by silk, and it's a couple layers of silk. So I think Zhuk exactly trying to do that, to parallel to Japanese kakemono. And also interesting in Yermolov, even when he depicted sunflowers, that a big triangle with smaller triangle is a typical Japanese pattern which called fish scale. So it's Ukrainians were emerged with European modernism. They know about Japanese art, about Japanese in general. So it's impressive how they combine all of these sources. Thank you again.
I want to respond to this in two words. You know, Japanism is typical for basically all European culture of the period, and starting much earlier. We have much better example of Japanism, which is Petritsky triptych Life, which is a combination of Klimt and ukiyo, which was not left unnoticed when it was exhibited in at the Venice Biennial, because if I'm correct, I don't remember. It seems that it was Margherita Sarfatti who stressed that this Japanization of Klimt is so interesting. Of course, people look at Japanese art. It's a general trend of the period.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for it's really fascinating range of material. But can I come back to your starting with the reference to Loos? Because, of course, Loos's article, it wasn't about aesthetics, although people think, you know, it was about economics. Yeah. And it was basically that ornament is criminal because it's a waste of time and money. And that came on the back of a long debate there'd been in the Habsburg Empire about folk art and the extent to which it could be used as an economic strategy. So in other words, you know, people like Eitelberger, for them, it was what you did to try and address peasant poverty was to develop, you know, training, especially because if you didn't, they'd come and go and work in factories and they become awful proletarians, you know, so you can't have that. So you try and keep the peasants in the villages and you give them the skills to develop. Now, I mean, the reason I sort of say that is because is there a danger of, we can see how, you know, these different motifs, you know, they become kind of floating signifiers almost of kind of peasant culture, but it seems to be a bit detached from questions of economics and economic policy, and, you know, so I'm interested to know what role did the authorities envisage for the peasant economy with it? Because, you know, I think just by looking at the you know, borrowings of formal motifs, that's only half of the story in a way, isn't it? Yes, I am. I was done years ago.
With you, you never know. Yeah, unfortunately, I had no time to develop because they were kicking me out of the podium. Because the real follower of Adolf Loos, who realized his ideas, was Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Because in 1945, he adopted the famous decision of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union about struggle against architectural excesses. And after this, all these ornaments disappeared, but not for a very long time, because very soon they came back by the early 60s, but in Ukrainian context, in the form of mosaics, which were put on these buildings. The question is that through the Soviet Union and through the Soviet life, and especially from Stalin period to post-Stalinist period, in the Stalinist system, it's a very serious model. It's a so-called survival of folk arts and folk art industry, which is manifested, not even in form, for me, one of the best examples of this. It's not Ukrainian, but Russian. We have, let's say, a revolution is happening. There are villages in Russia which are specialized in icon painting. They are not doing anything. They put the whole village painting icons. Yeah, so some people are preparing boards, other people are putting ground, third people are putting golded elements, others are painting faces, figures, etc. Revolution happens, these icons are not needed anymore. And these villages are starting to die of hunger. They're coming with the idea of what they can do, they cannot do too much. In this moment, two intellectuals, Bakushinsky and Vasilenko. Vasilenko, actually Ukrainian by birth, and I had a chance to know him, son of the Imperial Russian general. They're coming to this village saying, okay, guys, it's a beautiful, your icons, let's do something. And they're coming with the idea to paint on lacquer boxes or lacquer plates. And this is creating this art of so-called palich. It was not only palich, there are others, which is a full construct. It's a just sucked from the finger construct. It's a secular, in the beginning it's a secular icons, but they are just following some elements of these icons. But by late 1920s, it's turning into devil icons. It's a really devil icons. It's a scary thing. It's a it's a Stalinist propaganda in a form of icon painting. Like I don't know, we have this like hagiographic icons of saints, and they're doing hagiographic icons of young pioneer Pavlik Morozov, who denounced his parents, and So we have this artificial creation of this folk production. It's coming through until the end of the Soviet Union. We have in Ukraine the same thing, maybe not in such horrible form as this palich, but people are, all my childhood we lived surrounded by the special stores which were stories of so-called artistic production corporation, which it was a state organization. And they were here in some villages, some people were making ceramics, they were, which basically came in the end to production of chachkin. Production of national souvenirs, which you could buy, but still people lived in this, making, in the same time, some real folk artists exist. And yeah, but on the industrial and economic level, it came to this like good production of souvenirs, like foreigners are coming, you know, they have to buy something kind of Ukrainian. Yeah, sorry.
So, sorry for ending, but maybe in the evening we can discuss more about this topic. The next speaker will be Miroslav Halak. He's from the Belvedere, and he assisted for the exhibition, for the actual exhibition. He studied art history and art theory at the University of Trnava, Slovakia, and took part in the interdisciplinary study program ITSIS, Historische Kunst- und Literaturdiskurse, run by LMU, Munich, Ludwig-Maximilian-Universität, the University of Augsburg, the University of Regensburg, and the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, and the Central Institute for Art History in Munich. He obtained his doctorate with a dissertation on the semiotic basis of anthropomorphism in modern landscape painting. Since 2017, he has been assistant curator at the Belvedere. His research focuses on 19th and 20th century art, visual semiotics, and psychological aesthetics. He's also was several times here speaker for Symposium of Digital Humanities, and he has very much published in these parts. He made several exhibitions like Johanna Kandel, Material, womit gemalt wird und warum, in the Belvedere. He made his first big own exhibition, which will be shown in Czech, Grow, der Baum in der Kunst, first shown here in the Belvedere, and also Alois Moosbacher, Palinops, and he made also first exhibition of Spinek Sekal in the Museum Lidiaunik, and also here in the Belvedere an exhibition. He is member of the Association of Internationale de Critique d'Art, and he will give in 2024 at the Masaryk University in Brünn some lectures. Miroslav, for Slovak modernity in search of identity between folklore and industrialization, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. We are very late. Actually, we should have now the break. So I think because we are really in a half hour too late. So if you want, there is coffee, tea, and something to drink. So please, during my lecture, you can go out and drink some coffee, because yeah, that's the problem of long lectures. Yeah, and after we have talked about ornament and decoration, I will go a few years in the future, or a few years later, and talk about and a few steps more west, and I will show you some art from Slovakia in the my lecture is about Slovak modernity in search of identity between folklore, and it's actually more about folklore. So the interface between rural traditionalism and petty bourgeois conservatism is the most striking territory on the map of artistic modernism in Slovakia. The formal, stylistic and ideology evolution of the visual arts of the Slovak culture region takes place almost exclusively there. It's interesting to note that the territory in question is definitely not only geographically, but above all in terms of meaning by the coordinates Bratislava, Košice. This environment indicates specific sociocultural parameters that also intensify the work of Janko Alexi. This lecture will therefore use the painter Janko Alexi as a case study to discuss the treatment of folklore themes with a specific formal language, as with his contemporaries Martin Benka, Zoltán Pelúgyay, and Miloš Alexander Bazovsky. Alexi does not escape from cultural provincialism and ethnographic monothematicism. The absence of a significant and competitive cultural center in Slovakia contributed to programs that idealized the village and rural life in the countryside. Instead of these motives becoming part of a more complex spectrum of cultural identity of the emerging state formation, the periphery in Slovakia became a value reference. The countryside and its rural character, however realistically interpreted, could not substitute for the deeper intellectual stimuli arising from the accumulated philosophical, political, historical, religious, economic tensions of the time. Since the end of the 19th century, this creative restlessness has been accelerated in the metropolis such as Berlin, London, Moscow, Paris, Rome, Vienna, or even in the smaller centers of European countries that became definitely emancipated with the collapse of the imperial system after the First World War, such as Belgrade, Budapest, Krakow, Kiev, Ljubljana, Munich, Prague, Zagreb, and so on. Jan Abelowski notes in his paper Identity and Modernity the origins of artistic modernism in urban environments. Of course, it is possible to argue that some distinctive artistic expressions categorizing important branches of modern artistic expressions also come from the periphery, that they originate in the world of folklore. Tradition, ritual, fairy tales, and animism, such as in Marc Chagall work. However, these tendencies are not dominant for a given period and often, as in this case of Chagall, remain a solitary phenomenon of a given scene. Even well-known artists are coming to the metropolises from the countryside echo to main content of the energy of modernism in the coordinates set by club, coffee houses, salons, societies, academies, or proletarian societies. The question of why artists from Slovakia who studied in Prague or traveled to artistic centers such as Paris were unable to emancipate themselves abroad or even to stimulate avant-garde tendencies in our country, or in the Slovak country, with their work is worthy of comprehensive socio-cultural and cultural anthropological research. Dominik Skutecki, for example, reaching for the themes of the city and its life of the end of the long 19th century, brought back from Vienna, Venice, and Munich to appropriate artistic skills, but he did not surpass the peak of his work in the form of genre scenes from the surroundings of Banská Bystrica. It's a small city in the central of Slovakia. Maximilian Schurman did not benefit more from his direct contact with the French Impressionists and took away from Giovanni a less positivist than luminist understanding of nature, which was unfortunately an anachronism in the first decade of the 20th century. Edmund Gwerk was a critical and intellectually proficient artist who, thanks to his orientation in the cultural centers of Europe, certainly did not lack the appropriate outlook on his work also displays definite elements of avant-garde experimentation with form. However, the motivic nature of the region of the Central Slovak mining towns costs him the possibility of a more direct connection to the current of the new realist tendencies of international modernism. Imre Weiner Král was connected with Paris, both by study and deeper personal ties, and his work from the 1930s reached the quality of international surrealism, but his later, especially post-war work, already suffers from the stagnation and emptiness of the subject matter of small town in Bratislava. Ester Šimerová-Martinčeková was unquestionably one of the most progressive artists of the whole of modernism in Slovakia, and her Legerian variant of the shifts of Cubism was at least beneficial in the distribution of geometric reductive stylistic on our territory. However, the circumstances of the Second World War and the post-war socio-political as well as personal development unquestionably contributed to a resignation to a bolder evolution of her own approach. We could continue a similar enumeration with other solitary positions, but also with some loose groupings, such as Košice modernism, like here Antoni Jászós. And we will always be able to identify from the current optics those parameters that have cost this or that author a more prominent place in the global history of art. Each time, however, it is possible to state that the visual artistic idyll, pastoral poem, the psychograms of the rural population, the very specific ethnic character, and resonances of the avant-gardes in the second to third wave of reception remained unreadable to audiences outside the Slovak or Czech milieu. There are several interesting phenomena that are a clear challenge for more extensive research into the characteristic of artistic modernism in Slovakia and its contextualization in the intensive international networking of avant-gardes. In this paper, I will try to highlight one partial point, this principal problem of the broader theoretical reception of art in Slovakia by the mid-20th century, and that is the work with form. It will be too one-sided to limit our critical assessment of modernist movements in Slovakia to a mere enumeration of handicapping factors. It is also necessary to ask whether the resistant interest of Slovak art in a natural, rural, and small town elements has reached a position that nevertheless possesses qualities worthy of international comparison. It would certainly be possible to go figure by figure from our art history and define interesting futures resulting from the aforementioned inclination towards rural aesthetics, but it will be more useful to deal with an example that represent a very specific type of morphology in the artistic expressions of modernism in Slovakia, namely the 1930s phase of Janko Alexí's work. Jan Abelovský and Kateřina Bajcurová speaks of this work as speculative ornamentation and specifically in terms of a line of drawing that tends to balance and symmetry of the movement elements of the compositions and thus to overall balance. Those according to this intention dynamics are as true interaction at the level of external structures, resonating like a chord, but without contrapuntal extension. That's from the book from Abelovský and Bajcurová. The question remains whether the language of forms as used by not only Alexí but also by a large part of the creators of the so-called classical modernism in Slovakia is endemic in this country, or whether it can be contextualized. In doing so, the ambition is to provide a deeper starting point than the synchronic comparison of individual approaches across the international scene. Otherwise, the statement about, for example, speculative ornamentation in the work of Janko Alexí remains on the level of description of a phenomenon with no claim to a more general meaning constitutive validity. Is the Slovak province, or rather provincial Slovakia, a unique environment in which the formal qualities of the means of expressions, as we know them in Janko Alexi, Miloš Alexander Bazovsky, and partly in Marty Benka, Karol Ondrejčka, Gustav Mahler, Ľudovít Fula, and Mikuláš Galanda, could have been developed to a given extent exclusively, were to look for ideological and terminological sources that could serve as an alternative to the notion of speculative ornamentation. Alexei undoubtedly brought back many art historical inspiration from his studies and foreign sojourns, which Marian Vesely informs us about, referring to the artist's autobiographical texts. Among the principal names of Renaissance art in the different cities of his travels, he was enthusiastic about different positions of artistic creation, as evidenced by the names mentioned, such as Mihály von Munkácsy, Pál Színei Merse, from the time of his pharmacy practice and brief studies in Budapest, Mikoláš Aleš, Václav Brožík, and Jan Preissler during his studies at the Academy of Fine Art in Prague, Paul Cézanne, André Derain, Henri Matisse, and Maurice de Vlaminck from his stay in Paris. The Prague teachers Josef Loukota, Vlaho Bukovac, Maximilian Pirner, and Max Schwabinski conveyed important aspects to Alexei, which he later applied in his painting. Alexei's inclination towards figurative work and even a symbolist manner, transforming objective reality into polysemantic plans, is probably interpreted by these prominent representatives of the waning academicism of the 19th century in Bohemia. However, there was no explicit adoption of specific means of expressions by Alexei. Instead of a fascination by the female body and its ephemerally sensuous corporality, as can be noted in all of the aforementioned pedagogues, Alexei's figurative prototype becomes the rural man. Instead of stages, poses, and their anatomical studies, or intimate shots of a post-symbolistic and romanticizing style, Alexei constructs his rural iconography in a rather reduced, formally schematized diction. This trait, which is also inherent in Miloš Alexander Bazovsky's work from the 1930s, provides several clues from which to contextualize this work not only stylistically but also methodologically. The private preferences of Janko Alexei, which did not correspond to the trends of art in cultural centers, are clearly illustrated by a quotation by the Prague critic Karol Herein as early as 1923, which was taken up by Josef Ziger-Hronsky a decade later in the first volume of the series on Slovak artists, 1933. That's the text. As in Alexei's prose, there is a strong programmatic ensuring in vision of national attributes, which should be rural life, nature, and Christianity throughout his art. It's not surprising, therefore, that the aforementioned high culture, which is identified with the artistic production of Western Europe, does not meet the ideological prerequisites for his own painterly manifesto. One cannot help but not notice the role played by the idealization of national principles in this artistic thinking. Therefore, the opposition to the inauthentic and sophisticated art of the Western centers result in the search for new models, still stemming from the pan-Slavist projects and in the articulation of new aesthetics more in line with the color of the Slovak region. However, the form that was supposed to absorb the given visions and efficiently convey them in a new morphology of national exceptionalism is based on the foundation traceable at the beginning of the 20th century. These are tendencies in which, from the positivist reduction of the scene realized in Impressionism, as an increasing emphasis is placed on a geometric quality of the line as the fundamental starting point of any visual trace. This inclination also explains the pronounced ornamentation, contouring, isolation of shapes, and their composite fusion in Art Nouveau and other Jugendstil movements. In the young interwar state in which the population of Slovakia for the first time systematically and comprehensively addressed its cultural, historical, and geopolitical belonging, attention was focused on the most characteristic, namely the countryside and its folkloric manifestation. These became the template for an authentic and unique cultural identity, which the modernists in Slovakia set out not only to formalize with the help of modern methodological means such as Formkunst, but also to uncritically mythologize. The rationality of the geometrical analysis of the objective world and the logic of the formal correspondences of the individual subparts of the compositional whole became the bearers not of authentic aesthetics and structural qualities of shapes, but always carried with them the load for the heroization of the common man, the aestheticization of humanity, and the pantheistic optics of nature. Utopian visions of a magical life linked to nature and firmly bound to idealized traditions accumulated in distinct contours. But these contents remained unreadable outside to borders of the region because their formal quality was exotic for the Western European as non-European artistic artifacts, but incomparably less appealing because they operated with anachronism that the industrial centers sought to leave figuratively behind. What is the explanation for the almost obsessive reproduction of clocks, shirkas, drops, scarves, crosses and chapels, rakes, hay, fences, rolls and bows, valachs and clocks? From a portfolio of attributes, each person necessarily chooses those closest to his or her cultural circle. Picasso's guitars, Chagall's rabbits, Delaunay's Eiffel Tower, and Rousseau's automobiles may be identifying futures of particular stages and themes of the authors of modernist art, but they are not as significant as the aforementioned rural motifs in Slovakia. In the futurist choose as the goal of their endeavor the depiction of the technology-driven dynamics of the future, then for authors such as Alexei, Bazovsky and Benka, the cult of the rustic past could be a manifesto. It is interesting how these authors, who had the opportunity to get now to the life of big cities, cultural centers, offering a whole spectrums of diverse inspirations, programmatically attached themselves to a wooden house instead of an apartment building to a bell tower, instead of a cathedral, and to goose herder instead of a cabaret dancer. There is no doubt that it was in this contrast that Slovak artists were directed by the differences in values between the fast-paced, anonymously secular civilization of the West and between the romantic liturgy of the nature and the traditionalist spirituality of rural culture. The contact with foreign countries was apparently so short or so little intensive for these authors that they were unable to discover for themselves the higher meaning of modern societies in the environment of metropolises. Instead, returning to the familiar conditions of rustic Slovakia, they were confirmed in the view of a kind of deep, intuitive and intimate connection of rural men with the world of spiritual traditions and mythical visions. Josef Ziger-Hronsky, in his pathetic reflection on the virtues of Slovak art, although hurriedly speaks of the acquisition of art from that intuitive connection of man with his answers of nature, and nature forgets to remind us that this is how modernity acquires across the map of artistic isms. Taking inspiration from the cultural production of non-European cultures is essential to the formation of modern artistic expression. Consider African and Polynesian objects, which is in the late 19th century transcended the collections of ethnological institutes and fundamentally co-shaped the aesthetics of post-impressionist art movements. Expressionism without African masks, Modigliani, Brancusi, Picasso, Derain, and many others are in some artistic positions interpretable only through comparison with non-European cultural production. In the same way, many Czech artists work in this vein, inspired either by their own experience of traveling to these distant destinations, Otakar Nejedlí, or by popular exposures to exotic artifacts like Jan Preisler, Josef Čapek, etc. In addition to the fascination with shaped otherness in the tradition of Paul Gauguin, the artistic culture of non-European civilization seeks an authentic product of human creativity, uncontaminated by syncretism. Is not only the objects of material culture that were inspirational, but the whole body of intangible, ritual, everyday manifestations of societies and groups that did not fit into the grid of social conventions and ethnical norms of Western Europe. The destructiveness of expansionist colonialism, however, destroyed that utopian notion of finding the lost Garden of Eden. Yeah, all that remained, disappointment and fragments of distant worlds and unfamiliar social conventions which acquired a cult status in the art of modernity. It must be emphasized that the schematization of the theme as analyzed in Janko Alexi's work is not a unique phenomenon, but belongs to the tradition of formalizing tendencies that have been manifested in Europe since the turn of the 19th century at the latest. Indeed, the aforementioned formalization of oceanic, African, or folkloric motifs has a very similar ideological basis and motivation. It is always the search for unique motifs capable of visualizing alternative ideal worlds unencumbered by the necessity of progress in time and space. In the environment of the Slovak countryside, this idealization involves another essential identifying component. What was to be defined as Slovak had first to be grasped in some cultural, religious, linguistic, and other coordinates. In this endeavor, Slovak modern unfortunately forgot the view from the outside, how these newly postulated contours of the Slovak peculiarity should be read, and at the same time there was a necessary distortion of the internal view of the cultural specificities of the various regions of the territory of Slovakia. Paradoxically, the paraphrases of African cult objects were more legible or at least more attractive to the Western European audience than the Valaskas small carved axes in the hands of bandits in the dens of Carpathian forests. In Janko Alexi's best work, we encounter a contemporary formalist way of constructing objective reality, but this construction does not carry the critical content of Slovak culture and political self-definition, but is presented in a mythology full of distorting sentiments and unrealistic expectations. Yeah, thank you.
You all want to go to coffee?
We have just really few minutes because even at 4 o'clock we should start with a new panel. So I will say 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Yeah, maybe. And maybe the questions now by in the coffee break, if it's possible. Thank you.
Frage, jetzt zu spät. So, pardon. Legen wir es daher. Das Mikro ist natürlich gefährlich.